you very much. Thank you so much for having me. Good morning, and thank you so much to everyone at Skagen for the very warm welcome, all the organization, and it's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Louis-Vincent Gave, and as was said, I've been living in Hong Kong for the better part of the past 20 years. Before that, I lived in China a little bit, and before that, as my name implies, I was raised in France. And when I grew up in France, I went to a Jesuit school. And when I was at Jesuit school, we had a priest. He was very charismatic, very tall, very strong voice. And one day I turned to him and I said, "Father, is it true that Jesuit priests reply to every question with another question?" And he looked at me and he furrowed his brow and he said, "Who told you that?" And this was, with the benefit of hindsight, this was good training for me for what was to come in China. As everyone at Skagen will tell you, investing is so much about asking the right questions. The problem is, of course, when you look at China, you're not quite sure what asking the right question is, and all too often, when you ask a question, you get 20 other questions in return. And with that in mind, what I'd like to do today with you, perhaps, is go through some of the questions I have about China, but I'd also like to ask you some questions. And I'll start off with a very simple one. The very simple question, when you look at Chinese data, and you look at the incredible stability, for example, of Chinese GDP growth, I'll start off with a simple question for the audience and say, do you trust Chinese data? And can I get a show of hand of anyone who trusts Chinese data? All right, so that's about 0 for 300. That's pretty much par for the course. Yes, nobody trusts Chinese data. Nobody trusts Chinese data for very simple reasons. First, China is probably the one major economy to not have a free press. So it's sometimes hard to know really what's happening. This is why, as a firm, we have 10 people up in Beijing simply pretty much focused on trying to tell us what is happening. And this is why we also have a business doing nothing but corporate due diligence to try to find out really what is happening on the ground. It's not always an easy task. Like you, I don't trust Chinese data. Not only because China doesn't have a free press, but more importantly, China still has a Ministry of Propaganda. For all intents and purposes, that's what's written on the door. When you look at China, they have something called the Publicity Department of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's the name in China. Which brings me to my second question. What do you think this Ministry of Propaganda does all day? And it's not a mischievous question. Because let me ask you another question. When was the last time you read something positive about China? When was the last time you picked up the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or whatever, or Bloomberg or whatever you read, and you read something positive about China? Now, in a sense, this is surprising. This is a simple chart taken from The Economist, so arguably non-biased, which shows the contribution to global growth of the various major economies. And if you look really at the past decade, China has contributed roughly a third of global GDP growth, quarter in, quarter out. And China, last year, contributed more to global growth than the US, Japan, and Europe put together. And I'll come back to my other question. When was the last time you read something positive about China? Something that didn't tell you China was about to implode, China was massive social strife, pollution, et cetera, et cetera. What we've witnessed in China in the past 20 years, and is still going on, is in a sense the greatest economic miracle of the past 30 years. We've had 1 billion people come out of abject poverty. 30 years ago, people were starving. This is the biggest economic transformation in the history of humanity. But again, when was the last time you read something positive about China? Which begs the question, what do the guys at the Ministry of Propaganda do all day? Honestly. You could say, well, they work for the government, so maybe they're not very competent. They're not very competent bureaucrats. And that's one possibility, but I doubt it. The second possibility is that the situation is deteriorating so fast in China that even the spin doctors at the Ministry of Propaganda can't place a positive story on the international airwaves. That's possible, except the problem I have with that is that when you look at China from a bottom-up perspective, you don't see that kind of deterioration. China is now the biggest market for iPhone. Last year, Levi Strauss sales in China were up 24%. You look at Alibaba sales. You look at China's now the biggest markets for Boeing, for Airbus. From everywhere you care to look, it doesn't look as if China really is imploding. We can question, of course, the numbers, whether it's 6% growth or 4% growth or whatever, but the underlying demand has not imploded. So I don't personally think that the situation is so bad in China that the spin doctors can't put a positive spin on it. Which leaves you, again, with the possibility that the Ministry of Propaganda is a bunch of incompetents. Or I'd like to throw at you another possibility, and that's what I'd like to explore with you. That China has an inherent advantage, an inherent interest in perhaps painting a picture abroad of less strength than it really has. And why would that be? It would be for one of two reasons. The first is to hide China's reckless mercantilism in an age of, frankly, global deflation. The third and final possibility is to hide China's growing imperialism. But first, let's go to the first possibility, the one that you read about every day in the press on whether the Chinese economy is spinning out of control. Now, this is a chart highlighting growth in China's various regions, in China's 31 different provinces, growth in 2015. Black basically represents recession. Blue represents regions that are still in a massive boom. Now, as this chart highlights, what you saw in China last year and the year before is increasingly disparate growth between a northeast where coal is produced, steel is produced, shipyards, chemicals, the deeply industrial part of the country, where that is today, frankly, in deep recession, and the rest of the country that is very much humming along. In a sense, China today, the northeast of China, looks a lot like, say, the northeast of Britain in the 1980s, or the northeast of France in the 1980s. If you went to Leeds or to Newcastle in 1985, you probably wanted to slit your wrist. You would have thought there's no more depressing place in the world. If you go there today, you'd probably feel the same. And if you go to northeast China, this is very much what we have today. We've had massive ramp up in the production capacity in things like steel, cement, etc., as China was building up its infrastructure. And now that a lot of this infrastructure is built, the need for all these industries is no longer there. Now imagine that you're Xi Jinping, you arrive in power 3 years ago, and this is the landscape that you have. Part of your country is booming, and part of your country is busting, almost for structural reasons. How do you deal with this? How do you deal with this disparate economy across regions? And again, I've got a bunch of charts to illustrate this, but perhaps the simplest chart to illustrate this is the one that you see on the top left here, which is tax receipts. For me, in this time when there's so much skepticism around Chinese data, one of the hardcore data that we like to pin our hats on is tax receipts. Why? Because it represents real numbers. Regions have to report to the central government not only what their GDP growth was, but what their tax receipts were. And they can't really lie about the tax receipts because that's what the budgets are made out of. They can't say, oh, yeah, we raised 10 billion when they've only raised 7, because obviously then they'll have a 3 billion shortfall. Now, when you look at the tax receipts of the rest of China, what you find is that basically the tax receipts have been growing at 7 to 10% per year, really for the past 3 years. So the tax receipts in the rest of China tell you that growth is ballpark 7%. If you look at the North China, tax receipts are contracting. Tax receipts have been collapsing, which tells you that, of course, that part of China is in a deep recession. Which, once again, I said I'd have more questions than answers for you. If you were the Chinese government, and this is the economic landscape that you have, how do you deal with this disparity in growth? Now, Western investors look at this and say, well, China should devalue the renminbi and export its way back to prosperity. The problem with that, when you look at the China map, is that the exporting parts of China are the ones that are doing very well. Guangdong, the region around Shanghai, Zhejiang province, all the exporting region are booming along. The Northeast does not export very much. This is Chinese exports by province, and the value of their exports, both as a share of China's total exports and in US dollars. And the only two provinces of the North China 6 that are in trouble are Shandong and Liaoning. And as you can tell, they're not hugely exporting provinces. So it's not obvious to me that you deal with structural overcapacity in steel, in coal, in cement, etc., through a currency devaluation. The second option is to do what Margaret Thatcher did. Come in and say, the coal mine doesn't work, the steel mill doesn't work, let's shut it down, and you guys get on your bikes and go find jobs where you can. Of course, this goes very much against what China's been trying to achieve for the past 40, 50 years, which is preventing 100 million people moving from the countryside in one go into towns like Shanghai and Guangdong, because the infrastructure challenges that this would represent would be absolutely daunting. Which brings you to the third possibility, which is in essence, send good money after bad. Try to cushion the downturns in the northeast of China by subsidizing industries that frankly should be shut off. This, of course, is what my own country did, France, in the 1970s and 1980s. While England was shutting its coal mines and steel mills, France was taking a much slower approach to the project, which led to bigger increases in debt, etc. Now, I think one of the big regrets of most foreign investors is that 3 years ago when Xi Jinping came in, the talk was all about reform. It was all about shutting down the inefficient producers. It was all about improving China's productive capacity. And fast forward 3, 4 years later, and what you find is that instead of seeing that, we've seen more public investment in infrastructure. We've seen more companies and more SOEs kept afloat, and a lot less structural reduction in overcapacity that perhaps we were led to believe 3, 4 years ago. I'll give you a couple numbers to contrast and compare.